I'm Susan McIntosh, Interim Dean of Social Sciences, and it's my pleasure to introduce this webinar featuring distinguished faculty panelists from the Department of Political Science. They will comment on the recent presidential election and what we might expect in its wake, even as vote recounts continue in Georgia, and new vote recounts were requested today by the Trump campaign for the heavily Democratic Wisconsin counties that include the cities of Milwaukee and Madison. Each of our panelists will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and then we will have a question and answer session for the remaining 20 minutes. You can post your questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Questions will be selected and presented to our panelists by our moderator tonight, Professor Ashley Leeds. Professor Leeds is the chair of the Political Science Department. Her area of expertise is international relations, and she is recent past president of both the International Studies Association and the Peace Science Society. I'll turn it over to Professor Leeds now, with many thanks for her work in organizing this event, and she will introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Dean McIntosh, for that introduction and for all the assistance that you and your staff have provided in putting together this event. In so many ways, this election is historic. We'll have our first woman of color as vice president. We voted during a pandemic, and we had the highest number of votes ever cast in a presidential election, and will likely end up with the highest turnout rate since at least 1908. We know many of you have been following this election closely, and we're happy to be able to share some expert insight and then answer your questions. Our first speaker is Bob Stein, who's the Lena Gohlman Fox Professor of Political Science and the former Dean of Social Sciences here at Rice. He has significant expertise in elections and election administration, and in fact, his research about mail-in voting, early voting, and other relatively recent innovations in election administration were very important for policymakers in 2020 as they figured out how to conduct such an important election during a pandemic. He's going to talk to us briefly about how we might understand the 2020 election results. Bob?
I'm going to focus on the issue of polling and what may have gone wrong and why it's important for us to pay attention to it and what might be the lessons we've learned from the election. Quickly, let me show you just one screen here. This is the presidential polling accuracy by state. The line tells you whether or not the polling predicted the actual outcome of the election, and suffice it to say that anything below that red-blue line was over prediction for Biden, and there was a massive inaccuracy in the prediction of the outcome of the election for polls between September and election day. It was across all 50 states. If you want to get a better picture of this, look at the second slide here. These are the differences in the predicted poll and the actual result in battleground states, and once again, the polls were way off. And worse, this is the actual exit polling that was done on the day of election day, not in the traditional fashion of talking to voters as they left the polling location, but this was done on election day and afterwards. And there were two operations. AP did their own of 110,000, and election day coverage was done by the National Opinion Research. And you can begin to see that they couldn't even agree on who showed up and voted, whether it was seniors, whites, Latinos, Hispanics, or women with college education, the target populations. To say it briefly, polling in the 2020 election was not just off, it was worse than it was in 2016. There are probably a lot of reasons for that I'll talk about briefly, but maybe what we should ask is, why is it important? Is polling something that we do for our entertainment, something that evening news can cover, or does it have consequences for the way we govern? And I would argue that inaccurate polling makes it extremely difficult for candidates and parties to properly identify their supporters and talk to them. I might note here that what you saw in the way of data on polling is what we call the public polls, the polls that are done by the news outlets, whether they be the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Fox. All of those polls were equally inaccurate. But what's even more interesting is that at the MIT Election Data Science Center, they have access to proprietary polls that had been done by candidates, whether they were congressional or presidential. And here's the interesting news, they were also consistently inaccurate. So this is not a question of outlets telling us, liberal newspapers, liberal news outlets, candidates themselves are having a difficult time. Not only does it make it hard to conduct elections, but it makes it even more difficult to develop legislative agendas. You can't represent people who are your constituents if you don't understand their preferences. It may be that you understand the preferences of people who lobby you and interest groups, but public opinion presumably gives us a clear picture of where the general electorate, the men and women that vote, but don't necessarily lobby government. I think there's several explanations for what went wrong, but probably the best one that I've seen so far, and one that's beginning to hold up as we do post-election analysis, is that we didn't anticipate the high turnout. It isn't just a high turnout, and I don't want to correct my chairman, but it's the highest turnout since 1900, when women, African Americans, and many other people in this country weren't allowed to vote, including people over the age of 18 but under 21. We're talking 2 centuries. Yet we had over 2.5 times more money spent in this election. And the simple fact of the matter is the outcome of the election doesn't look all that much different than what happened in 2016. When Dean McIntosh talked about the recount in Wisconsin, Wisconsin produced 23,000 vote victory for Trump in 2016, and in 2020, he loses the same state by 21,000. That's true for Pennsylvania and Michigan. I think probably some of the errors is simply that people who voted in this election were not readily accessible to pollsters. Populations, particularly like Hispanics, who for the first time showed significant movements as well as African Americans towards a Republican candidate, Donald Trump, didn't show up at anybody's polling. Exit polls showed the same problem, and normally we would say, well, we'll weight our samples. So just simply make those voters that we did talk to count more in our polls. The problem, of course, is that there's something different between the Hispanic or African American or women with college education that we talked to and the ones we didn't talk to. I think there are a couple of other problems with polling, not the least of which is that many voters do not like to talk on the phone to live telephone interviewers. We've learned in polling that there are many different platforms, live telephone interviewing, internet. We've even done recorded telephone calls, robocalls, and even mail-in voting. And it may be that one of the things we'll find is that the accessibility of voters is better done when you allow them to choose the platform on which they want to do the interviewing. Lastly, I think it's worth pointing out that surveyed populations need to be identified, and it may be that polls should not be released with one result, but with multiple results reporting different rates of turnout. Lastly, I think there's some reason to believe that the source of the problem may also be the competition among news outlets to get their stories and their interviews done. And oftentimes it takes longer than 3 or 4 days to conduct a survey, but the pressure on a lot of outlets is to get their results out in press quickly. I'm going to stop there and be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thanks very much, Bob. Our next speaker is Leslie Schwindt-Bayer, who is professor of political science and also our director of undergraduate studies. Her research focuses on politics around the world with a particular focus on Latin America. And 2 of her areas of expertise are gender and politics and political corruption. She's going to help us understand the Trump reaction to the 2020 elections and perhaps why we haven't yet seen a formal concession. Leslie?
Great, thank you very much for having me as part of this panel. So I'm going to put a comparative spin on the election, focusing on what we can learn from other presidential systems about a disputed election outcome, why candidates and parties dispute elections, and what is likely to come next. While many people have been surprised and concerned by Trump's refusal to accept the election results and concede, a look at how populist presidents and presidential candidates in other countries have behaved in similar situations reveals that this behavior is really not uncommon. In Latin America, where all countries are presidential, populists like Trump have run for president and/or been frequently elected. To name just a few, we have Evo Morales, who is a former president of Bolivia. He fled the country last year after 3 terms in office and a disputed election that most observers actually think was rigged in favor of him. There was Hugo Chavez, the now deceased but former longstanding president of Venezuela, who took over in a broken party system as a president of the people. Keiko Fujimori, a two-time candidate for Peru's presidency, and the daughter of a former president who has built on her father's supporters and movement, but not yet won a presidential election herself. And Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the current president of Mexico, who had a long road to the presidency, including a disputed election. All of these leaders have been embroiled in close elections that ended in allegations of fraud and illegitimacy by the losing candidate. A recent study found that between 1974 and 2012, 21% of presidential election results worldwide were rejected by the losing party or candidate, and 15% of those were largely free and fair elections. Disputed elections, therefore, are not rare events. So why do candidates and leaders like Donald Trump dispute election results? Well, research shows that there are rational and strategic reasons for this type of behavior. One reason is that they want to hold on to power regardless of the cost. For many leaders, it is a last-ditch effort to maintain power when it might otherwise be slipping away. Initially, it seems that Trump might have thought that claiming a fraudulent election would help him stay in power. This is a tactic that dictators commonly use. Hugo Chavez used this successfully in Venezuela a couple of times to push down a surging opposition and help to ensure his longstanding hold on power. Yet it also occurred alongside of a move away from democracy and toward a dictatorial regime. And I'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but I don't think the US is in danger of becoming a dictatorship in the next 2 months and allowing Trump to remain in office. So this rationale is unlikely to fully explain Trump's behavior. A second reason that politicians dispute elections is to highlight non-democraticness in an election process. Disputed elections have been used in countries to focus greater scrutiny on the election process, usually to demonstrate that it is not free and fair. In the US right now, we're seeing efforts to do that, but so far they're really revealing that the election process was highly robust, free, fair, and legitimate. This is good for US democracy, though it may not lead to the outcome that Trump intended when he began this. A third reason to dispute an election is to rally supporters and to build a strong base to position oneself for future political opportunities. A populist candidate who plans a political career and who has developed a strong following can use the shared sense of injustice that comes around a disputed election to try to mobilize supporters and maintain the longevity of their movement. López Obrador used this tactic in Mexico after his close election loss in 2006, encouraging supporters to take to the streets, protest, and not accept results that he claimed were fraudulent. This ensured deep and long-lasting support for him that prompted him to run for president 2 more times, finally resulting in a victory in 2018. We don't know where Trump is headed next, perhaps another presidential run in 2024, perhaps his own TV network, but he is using this election to rally his base and strategically set the stage for whatever he sees coming next. So these are some reasons why leaders might dispute an election and why Trump specifically might be disputing the 2020 results. So what are some common outcomes of disputed elections in presidential systems, and what insights can we gain from them for the US case? Well, at one extreme, we've seen incumbents outright reject election results, refuse to leave office, and ultimately change constitutions, laws, and political norms to try to consolidate power in the long term. This was a strategy that Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolás Maduro, in Venezuela have used, and it has ensured 22 plus years combined in office and has essentially turned Venezuela into a dictatorship. Let me again reassure you, I do not believe that this is where we are headed in the US, but I'll come back to this. Another outcome that's been common in other countries has been an incumbent refusing to accept election results, manipulating the results to benefit him or herself, and then fleeing office and sometimes the country when political pressure gets too intense or the military steps in. We saw this in Bolivia last year with former President Evo Morales. A third outcome that we've seen in disputed elections is losing candidates encouraging mass protests that spark political violence post-election. As mentioned previously, López Obrador used this tactic in Mexico after the disputed 2006 election, and he went even further to form a shadow or a parallel government, complicating the governing process for the incoming party, the PAN's, Felipe Calderón, who legitimately won that election. Fortunately, we have not seen much in the way of large-scale or violent protests in the US post-election, and that bodes well for this not being an outcome that we'll see here in the US. Finally, and probably the most common outcome, is initial claims of fraud and illegitimate elections that die out as the results are later to be found to be free and fair. And candidates or leaders ultimately just move forward to fight another day. In Peru, Keiko Fujimori initially disputed a very close election to Pedro Kuczynski in 2016, when she lost by less than 1/4 percentage point. Her spokesman at the time claimed, "We have the absolute right to count all of the votes," and also said that no one, absolutely no one, neither of the political parties can sing victory. And he said that in the aftermath of the election. She, however, conceded soon after, once all the votes were counted, and it was clear that the election was largely free and fair. Her party's large majority elected to the Congress helped too, because she had a vehicle to remain dominant on the political scene after the election. It's too early to know exactly which path the US is headed down, but there are good reasons not to expect the worst. For one, US democratic institutions are strong and already have proven robust post-election. There's been no evidence so far of widespread fraud. The courts are working and legitimizing the election results, and elites are accepting the results, albeit slowly in some cases. According to the Americas Barometer, which is a survey that's conducted throughout the Americas, in 2018, their survey showed that 74% of people in the US think that democracy is the best form of government. This is higher than any other country in the Americas, with the exception of Uruguay, which beats the US with 77%. But this bodes well for democracy in the US and decreases the likelihood that we would see Trump remain in office beyond January 20th. Instead, the most likely outcome is that democratic and political pressure will become intense enough that eventually Trump will leave office of his own volition, perhaps never fully accepting the results or conceding, but framing it as moving on to something more tremendous and better than staying in office. He will find a way to leave that will preserve his image among supporters and use it to bolster his movement. I think what is absolutely clear, regardless of how Trump leaves office, however, is that Trumpism is here to stay. Trump tapped into a public frustration and disillusionment that many people did not realize existed. A large subset of Americans see themselves as excluded politically, economically, and socially, and are actively demanding to be part of our system. Trump won 70 million votes in the 2020 election. That is not a small number. His ideas, approach, and brazen attitude are appealing to many, and the disputed election is not only working to deepen, and the disputed election is only working to deepen voters' attraction to him. That has not gone away with losing the election, and in fact, the 2020 election outcome may have even made it worse. The challenge, therefore, is how Biden, both parties in Congress, and I think all of us as members of this country's community will work together to bring the country back together. It's going to be one of several big challenges that face us over the next 4 years. If we don't address this, we can expect a very bumpy political road for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Our third speaker is Lyn Ragsdale, who holds the Tsanoff Chair of Public Affairs here at Rice. She's a professor of political science and another former dean of the Rice School of Social Sciences. Professor Ragsdale's current research focuses on the presidency, and she's going to talk to us about what we might expect from the Biden administration, especially as it pertains to domestic policy.
Thank you, Ashley. In a recent interview, Joe Biden was asked whether he was the polar opposite of Donald Trump. And without hesitation, he said, "I sure hope so, and then proceeded to make the sign of the cross. In the past 4 years, anytime I've spoken about Donald Trump, whether in class or at public events like this, I've always used the word unprecedented. He is a one-of-a-kind president. There is nothing that he sort of didn't upend in the 4 years that he was in office. And there really are no guideposts to sort of understand Donald Trump in a lot of ways. You can't go back across presidential history and say, oh, what he just did reminds me of Millard Fillmore, or, oh, what it reminds me of Calvin Coolidge. He really is a kind of power unto himself. But what about Joe Biden? It seems to me that he is not going to be a kind of unprecedented president, but in a different and opposite direction from Donald Trump. Nor is he going to return us to normalcy, whatever that is. Instead, what I see him doing is being an institutionalist president. And in many ways, that's sort of in his DNA, right? He has made a big point of being an institutionalist throughout his career in government, both as a senator and as a vice president. And in many ways, he's actually the best student of the American presidency that we've ever seen hold office. It was remarkable to me when I added these numbers up, but it turns out that Joe Biden essentially was privy to the actions of 8 different presidents, from Nixon to Obama, while he was either in the Senate or was vice president. And runner-up is George H.W. Bush, who was only privy to 5 presidents while he was working in government. So what is this institutional behavior that I think Biden is going to offer going to look like? And I think there are 3 aspects. The first is the image of the president. The second is relations with Congress. And the third is the use of presidential power. And it seems very clear to me that Biden, even through the campaign, was presenting himself in very measured, very disciplined ways as a kind of image that we've seen for years before, and that is the president of all of the people. Very much the polar opposite of Donald Trump, presenting himself quite intentionally as the president of only some of the people, i.e. his base. And so this idea of acting on behalf of all of the people, acting on behalf of all of the country, really emerges from a precedent set long ago, just at the turn of the century, the 20th century, with Theodore Roosevelt. And so there's a key indicator of this, which is how much trust do people pay and put into Joe Biden. And there was an Axios poll that came out this morning, which looked at how much trust do you have in the information that Biden shares about COVID. And not only did that number increase by 10 percentage points from prior to the election to now, but it's at 56%. And the same number for Donald Trump is at 30%. The other thing that I think is also very interesting and a little bit humorous about the rollout of the Biden elect portion of his term is how they've made a good deal of noise about how the Biden dogs, yes, the Biden dogs, are going to be coming to the White House. Champ and Major, one of whom is a shelter dog, are coming to the White House. And what's kind of interesting about that is it sort of suggests how presidents want to present themselves in familial ways. They want to present themselves as just like any other person. And Biden will pick up a string from William Howard Taft to Barack Obama of pets in the White House. Yes, William Howard Taft had 2 pet cows, and then all the way through to Barack Obama with Bunny, with Sonny and Bo, their Portuguese water dogs. And so now Champ and Major, imagine the Americana coming out of just those names alone, right? The old-fashionedness, the spirit of Champ and Major are going to be returning, or not returning, but arriving, I should say, at the White House. So I think that's very important that he's creating an image of the president that is very different than his predecessor. The second thing is relations with Congress. And he has said that he is going to have a bipartisan agenda before Congress. And we'll see how that works. We, of course, did not have a great deal of bipartisanship during the Obama years. We had even less during the Trump years. But there are certain things that he is going to present, partly around COVID, partly around infrastructure, partly around certain other things that I think could bring us back to a kind of bipartisanship. He also has good working relations. He's not friends, he's not buddies, but he has good working relations with Mitch McConnell, which is arguably the biggest pressure point in terms of bringing bipartisanship. But we'll see. But that is at least his intention, which of course, again, going along the lines of the polar opposite, was certainly not the intention of the even the initial days of the Trump administration. And finally, let's take a quick look at presidential power. And here again, I think Biden is recalling in a very institutional way a kind of power that Theodore Roosevelt presented, in this case, in his autobiography. He announced that he was the steward of the people. And the steward of the people could and should act actively and affirmatively to do all he could for the American people, unless the Constitution or the laws forbid it. And so this is a very unifying message again. It very much fits with the kind of imagery that Biden is offering in terms of being the president of all of the people, and also the bipartisanship within his work on Capitol Hill. Now, this is also quite distinct from what is typically called the unitary executive approach that the Trump White House used. And the idea there is because the president is the head of the entire executive branch, he gets to act on behalf of the American people in whatever way he sees fit, because he's the head of this very large entity, even if it violates the Constitution or the laws. And of course, we saw multiple examples of the executive, the unitary executive during the impeachment trial. We saw it in terms of Trump suggesting that he could self-pardon. We saw it in terms of a variety of other behavior. But it's unlikely that we're going to see that approach come through in the Biden administration. To be clear, there's plenty of power to go around in the stewardship approach. Presidential power under stewardship has grown ever wider and ever bigger. So I will leave you with that and with a couple of additional predictions, because I think both Rick and I are in the most tenuous of positions. We're trying to predict a presidency that isn't even an official presidential elect yet. But I will predict that Biden will have a honeymoon, both with Congress and with the public, that his approval rating will at least be over 50%, which was never true of President Trump. And most importantly, that the two dogs, Champ and Major, will love the White House lawn just as much as the two pet cows. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Our final speaker tonight is Ric Stoll, who's the Albert Thomas Professor of Political Science. His research focuses on international relations and American national security policy. Professor Stoll is going to talk about what we should expect in a Biden foreign policy, and particularly where it will be similar and where it will be different from that of President Trump. Rick?
Thank you very much. Let me start by briefly discussing the consequences for foreign policy President Trump not conceding. The first thing in terms of foreign policy is that means that Biden is not getting daily national security briefings from the intelligence community, something that is typically known as the president's daily brief. Second of all, normally, and this would apply to beyond foreign policy folks, to national security folks, when there's an election and the new president starts announcing the people he's going to have in this position or that position, there are conversations between the incoming people and the current people. That is not happening, and I can't imagine that will be able to happen until Trump concedes. It also may well slow down the clearance process that will be necessary for new officials who are certainly in the national security arena. So we could have President Biden taking office without his people totally being prepared or even able to take over right away. This was something, as some of us remember, there was a little problem after the 2000 election. There was a period of time before it was clear that Bush would be president. And the 9/11 Commission noted that, one problem that developed was the Bush administration didn't have its people fully in place on day one. They didn't have the information they may have needed. Not that anyone thinks, well, it would have been easy to prevent 9/11, but the failure of Trump to concede is definitely slowing down the process of transferring power to national security people. Okay, let me now talk a little bit about various issues. The issue agenda is not really any different with the Biden administration from what it was with the Trump administration, but we already heard from Biden some of the things that he will be doing differently in terms of policy. So in no particular order, Iran, the United States exited the nuclear deal with Iran. And one of the responses was that Iran said, okay, if you're leaving, we can go back to enriching uranium. And they now have 12 times the enriched uranium they did and were allowed to have under the 2015 nuclear deal. Biden has said he will rejoin that deal if Iran returns to strict compliance with it, and that he will try to strengthen and extend that deal. Okay. There are a number of other issues with Iran, and Biden hasn't really spoken up about those, but he's going to have to deal with them. One is freeing the Americans that are detained by Iran. There are at least 4. Trying to do something about Iranian violations of human rights within their own country. And also, of course, Iran in a number of ways supports groups and actions against the United States in a variety of countries in the Middle East, and Biden will have to contend with that. Afghanistan, Trump just announced that he would be withdrawing some of our troops from Afghanistan and Iraq and Somalia for that reason as well. Biden had already said he was not interested in reducing immediately troop levels. We are part of a peace negotiation in Afghanistan with the Taliban. The Afghani government has recently just joined those negotiations. And there is a pretty strong feeling that a precipitous US withdrawal of troops, and this is less to do with the numbers and more to do with the symbolism, would hurt those negotiations. And Trump's recent announcement about that, actually, he didn't make the announcement, one of his officials did, has been criticized by NATO allies, senior Republicans, including Mitch McConnell. So that's something that the situation in Iran and its multiple dimensions will be, I think, something the Biden administration has to devote a lot of time to. North Korea, Biden has said he would jumpstart, I'm quoting from him, a sustained coordinated campaign with our allies and others, including China, to advance our shared objective of a denuclearized North Korea. The same problem the Trump administration has faced. I wish him luck with that. I wish President Trump luck with that. I wouldn't bet a lot of money it's going to happen, but I think it's something that's important to pursue. With regards to Russia, there are several issues. The one I wanted to highlight is we have an arms control agreement called New START that limits each side to 1,550 warheads. That is set to expire in February next year, but it can be renewed for up to 5 years by both parties simply saying, yes, let's renew it. Biden has said he will do that, and he wants to move beyond that agreement. China. A bunch of issues here. As you probably know, on November 11th, China passed a resolution saying any lawmaker supporting Hong Kong's independence or threatening the national security of China should be disqualified. That led to the immediate dismissal of 4 Hong Kong legislators. Another 15 who are sort of with those 4 resigned in protest because of that. China it was announced on November 15th, something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which has 15 countries that consist of about 30% of the world's GDP. So it's a very big agreement. The US is not part of it. China is clearly the leader. It comes at the same time that China, through something called the Belt and Road Initiative, is trying to do some good things, but also to increase its influence with various countries in Asia and beyond. There's also the issue of Taiwan, the status of Taiwan. We have this very kind of strange thing where we recognize China, the government of China, but we still maintain some significant relationship with Taiwan. And behind all of this is whether China will choose to work within the existing international order, become a full player or more significant player in the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, for example, or will they try to sort of build their own structure? And if you look back at history, you can see, China is gaining in power. The U.S. has slowed down. What happens when somebody passes the world's most dominant power? Well, the US managed to do it with Great Britain, and there was no war. We fought our wars long before that, but there was no war when we passed them. On the other hand, we have Germany passing Great Britain, and that was associated, I'm not saying it was the cause, but associated with 2 world wars until that got settled. And of course, we had the Cold War competition between the US and the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union did not pass the United States, but we were rivals with them, and not every thing that happened during the Cold War was a lot of fun. I think something else that we can see out of the Biden administration is to reassure our friends and allies in NATO and in the Pacific that we will be a reliable partner, and that Biden will explain why we, the United States, gain things from having those allies. It's not a one-way street where they gain from having us and we get nothing out of that. Okay. Finally, Biden has two things Biden said he will change. One is that the U.S. will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, which is about greenhouse gases. And finally, Biden announced the U.S. would, the Trump administration had announced in July the U.S. would withdraw from the World Health Organization in July of 2021. You have to give notice. That's why it took so long. Biden said, no, we're going to stay in. I would think, they work primarily, not exclusively, but primarily with health issues in developing countries. But we may have learned that if a serious health issue occurs in some other country, sometimes it ends up affecting the United States. And so I think having the World Health Organization doing its work, being aided by the United States is probably a good thing. So I expect to see some differences in foreign policy under the Biden administration, but the basic challenges will be the same as under the Trump administration.
Thanks so much, Rick. We're going to turn now to some audience questions. We have quite a number of them, so we'll get through as many as we can. And I'm going to take the liberty of rephrasing some, since there are several questions that have been asked in different ways by different audience members. I'm going to start with a question for Professor Schwindt-Bayer. Several people are asking, why haven't top Republicans called for Trump to concede?
No, that's a great question. And I think my answer is that there are strategic reasons for top Trump Republicans to continue to support Donald Trump. We have to remember that right now in particular, he's critically important to the Republican Party. They still have 2 Senate runoff races in Georgia in January. And they can't afford to lose those races. And so they can't afford to lose Trump and Trump supporters at this point in time. So in the short term, I think that they won't fully abandon him in the short term, with those races really still hanging in the balance. I think in the longer term, they're also still very beholden to him because of the size of the support that he has. They risk losing voters and, in some ways, even spurring the emergence of a Trump-based third party that would be hugely detrimental to the Republican Party if it was successful. The way that the U.S. electoral rules are set up with the single-member district plurality election rules, and because Trump's support is so geographically distributed, the emergence of a third party could actually be a really viable thing, and that would be really bad for the Republican Party. So I think it's unlikely that we're going to see top Republicans publicly disavowing Trump or separating themselves from him. Those are the reasons that I would offer.
Thank you. The next question, I'm going to go to Professor Ragsdale. And this has to do with the relationship that you would expect between Biden and a Senate potentially led still by Mitch McConnell. Of course, we won't know until the Georgia runoffs are completed. But several people are noting how obstructionist they view the Republican Senate under Obama, and wonder about Biden's ability, for instance, to get cabinet officials confirmed. Others are asking about the personal relationship that Biden and McConnell have, and whether you think that will make a difference in how the branches work together. So I'm hoping you can answer a set of questions related to Biden's likely relationship with the McConnell Senate.
Right. Well, those are really good questions. And I mean, I do think you cannot underestimate the fact that Biden and McConnell are colleagues. I mean, I don't think you can use the word friend, but they are colleagues. I also think you can't underestimate that Biden, at least when he was vice president, less so when he was a senator, he was actually much more a go along, get along kind of senator, perhaps, certainly during the sort of middle years of his Senate career. But at least in this case, when he was vice president and negotiating part of the stimulus bill right after the Obama administration took over and so on and so forth, he's actually a very strategic negotiator, and he's not at all afraid of giving Republicans something that they want. And that was something that actually even though when Obama was president, he would constantly say, well, tell me what you want and we'll see if we can do it. But that wasn't what they were looking for. They were looking for, here, look, I recognize this is what you want. Now, can we negotiate off of that? And I think Biden has demonstrated, both as vice president and at least in his discussions, that he's savvy enough to perhaps figure out what that thing is that they want. And so that puts Mitch McConnell in a very different position, because now we can always say, well, he does party over country, or he does party over government or whatever. But now he's being presented with a situation where his party is getting something as opposed to just being asked whatever that might be. So I, I mean, again, I go back to my honeymoon thing, but honeymoons historically in the American presidency are very short unless you play them correctly. And so, I say the first 6 months, we'll see. We'll see by June whether he has actually lived up to the kinds of things that he did during Obama that he was not restrained from doing. So we'll see.
Thanks very much. I'm going to go next to Professor Stein. Several people asked questions about the possibility that Trump supporters may have been purposely telling pollsters that they were going to vote for Biden and that produced the polling errors. And so people are asking if there's been any verification or investigation of whether voters were deliberately lying to pollsters. And if so, what could be done about this in the future? You have to unmute yourself, Bob. You're still muted.
How's that?
Good.
There's always been a problem of voters and respondents misrepresenting their preferences, and there are easy ways for pollsters to discern that. Sometimes this is also known as the shy Trump voter problem, where many Trump supporters in 2016 might not have felt comfortable expressing a preference to something called the social desirability, that people were being ostracized for expressing that preference. It didn't really exist in 2016. We didn't see it in 2020. In fact, polling would seem to suggest that, in fact, the bigger problem was simply reaching people who we had not expected to turn out in this election. I think the bigger surprise was not that the Trump supporters did so well. They were, as I think we all know, 71, close to 72 million. It was that we had many, many more people voting in this election than we've seen ever, and particularly over 2016 and 2018. And we weren't certain who these voters were, and particularly in communities of color, particularly Hispanic men over 45, we were seeing double-digit increases in voter turnout, and they were not voting the way Hispanic voters had voted in the past. So my sense is that there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But I don't think it's going to be the shy voter or the intentional misrepresentation of vote choices. Most people know who they're going to vote for, and in fact don't have a problem telling pollsters. The big problem is whether they'll vote. And that's where you get a lot of misrepresentation and underrepresentation.
Thanks, Bob. Professor Stoll, we have a couple of questions here about the TPP, both about how badly Trump's decision not to participate in the TPP hurt America's long-term interests, and whether you think the Biden administration will try to join an agreement similar to the TPP.
I think I don't know if it was a gigantic hurt, but I think it did hurt. I think it was a good idea to be part of it. I expect that the Biden administration will go back to it. Now, exactly how you do it, Obama signed it, right? And then Trump said no, and I don't know legally, can Biden just say, hey, we're going back, or give me a piece of paper, I sign my name. So he'll go through that. I doubt he'll send it to the Senate to be ratified unless he thinks, he can get 2/3 vote. And right now that seems unlikely, maybe not impossible if he, as Professor Ragsdale was talking about, kind of reaches out across the aisle and, I'm one of you guys, help me out here. This is a good deal. But so I think he'll do the equivalent of re-signing it, but ratification, not, he won't submit it unless he thinks it's virtually guaranteed that the Senate will pass it.
Thanks very much. Professor Schwindt-Bayer, we have a number of questions as well about the issue of democratic backsliding. And so an audience member asks, in a comparative context, do contested elections lead to long-term doubts about democracy among the citizens? And someone else asked if Trumpism and the Republican Party's support of Trump is a form of democratic backsliding. Could you speak to those issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in Latin America in particular, we've seen a reasonable amount of democratic backsliding since the initial transitions to democracy in the 1980s. For the first 20 or so years, it looked like those democracies were going to continue to build and continue to progress and stick around for a long time. And what we've really seen is sort of a move away from there have been a movement toward more liberal democracy, and now a move sort of backsliding a little bit to more of electoral democracies where they're free and fair, but not really providing bigger benefits to their population or necessarily respecting civil rights and political liberties. In the US, I'm not sure that I would say that we have democratic backsliding yet, but I do think that there are reasons to be concerned that over the long term, doubts that come from contested elections could potentially lead to less and less support for democracy as the best form of government. So we could potentially see those numbers drop down a bit over time. I don't think it's going to be a sudden thing, but I do think it's something that is something that we need to be aware of. I don't see Trumpism and the Republican Party's support of Trump necessarily as a form of democratic backsliding. I think it's more a form of strategically trying to maintain the political future of the Republican Party.
Thanks very much. Professor Stein, building on something that you said in response to the last question, we have a question about Hispanics in the Rio Grande Valley and rural areas. The audience member notes that they voted for Trump rather than Biden, at least at levels that were not predicted. The audience member says that they've heard that Hispanics are taken for granted within the Democratic Party and is interested if you've seen any polling or data to explain what happened in the Rio Grande Valley with Latino voters for the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign. You need to unmute.
I think the simplest answer is that one of the lessons we've learned is that people of Hispanic heritage are incredibly diverse. They're diverse in terms of national origin, they're diverse in terms of their economic and social and educational background. Proof of that is in Arizona, Hispanics voted overwhelmingly for Biden. In Florida, they voted overwhelmingly for Trump. And in the middle was Texas. Texas Hispanic voters, we don't have the full numbers because polling is not only inaccurate, but very inadequate in terms of numbers. But we see in the Valley, McClellan, Zapata, Hidalgo, that we're seeing 40% of Hispanic surname precincts voting for Trump. And those numbers are up at least 12 to 15 points over the 2016. We saw new voters in precincts that I've looked at in, I think, 8 Valley counties where there was an increase in new registration. It was almost always males over the age of 45, and it's pretty clear they were voting for Trump. Polling and exit polling, if it's accurate, seems to suggest that they consider the economy far more important than the threat of COVID and look to the president as a carrier. And yes, I think it's time for Democrats to get really honest with themselves. They've never looked at the Hispanic vote as a reliable turnout. They have tilted heavily towards redistricting in Black districts to the expense of trying to create majority-minority Hispanic districts. And I think finally, Karl Rove, who was a mastermind of this strategy back when George W. Bush was even governor of Texas, thought that Hispanic voters would be much more likely to be persuadable to vote for Republicans on school choice, social issues like abortion, same-sex marriage. And I think in spite of the Republican Party and President Trump's efforts to push away this population on issues of immigration, it simply has not worked. Many Hispanics simply found the president the talisman for the economy. And I'll give you another piece of evidence. In a state like California, which had an affirmative action issue on the ballot as a referendum issue, Hispanic and Asian Americans voted 2-to-1 against the affirmative action ballot in spite of a 2-to-1 support among African Americans. I think some of my colleagues in my department would probably talk to this more authoritatively, like Melissa Marshall, but I think the notion that the Democrats have a rainbow coalition along race, ethnicity, on issues of gender, not going to work anymore. They've got to really talk to economic and social public policies, education, and particularly on healthcare. I think it's a lesson the Democrats are going to have to see, not only in Texas, but in much of the South and Southwest.
Thank you. Professor Stoll, do you think our allies, having been forced to disengage with the United States to some extent, will hesitate to re-engage? How easy will it be for President Biden to reestablish strong relationships with our allies?
I think it's going to involve more than just one speech or whatever, but, I think, the United States has been regarded as a helpful ally for a long period of time. And so I think Biden has a good chance to just remind people of that and have them see what happened under Trump as being an aberration and not there's no question that Americans are not as interested in foreign policy issues as domestic issues, right? So there's that, but I think Biden has a good chance. Again, he's known to a lot of these leaders of convincing them, no, we're here for you. We're going to be a reliable ally. We're going to work together to solve these problems.
Thank you. We're coming up near the end of our hour, so I think this may be the last question, and I'm going to turn to Professor Ragsdale. And I think this is a question that a lot of people are concerned about, and that is, how do you see us coming back from the increased polarization we've seen in the last few years? Do you think that there's hope that a Biden administration will be able to accomplish that?
Well, I mean, I think that his expressed bipartisanship, or at least attempt at bipartisanship, is going to be a useful step. I don't think we can underestimate how much dismantling went on during the Trump years. The other thing that I think would be, very, very useful for Biden, and that is to regularly go on Fox News. Because one of the things we haven't actually had a chance to talk about tonight are these silos and media bubbles. And so to the extent that he can look like a normal voice, that he can look like somebody who's actually not, somebody with horns and with smoke coming out of his nose to a very large audience, I think that could go a long way. And so we'll see. Are they savvy enough? I think he sort of knows he needs to do that. I also think that this attempt by Trump to start a new network or something like that, that's going to take a lot more work than just saying, I'm going to start a new network. And there's a lot of cash at Fox News. There are a lot of personalities at Fox News. And for Biden to be able to just sort of cut into that broadcast and say, oh, hi, I'm the president, in just the same way that Trump did, but in a Biden way, I think could be very, very useful.
Thanks so much. Well, I just want to take the last minute to thank our panelists and to thank all our audience members for engaging with us on these really important issues for the US and the world right now. And I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving and an excellent 2021. Thank you very much.